Come to order. Committee meets to receive the testimony of the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on the administration's fiscal year 2018 budget request. We welcome Secretary Mattis for the first time before our committee, and we welcome Chairman Dunford back. The question today, as it is each year for this hearing, is how well the administration's proposal meets the security needs of the nation, factoring in both the external threats and the current state of our military. This committee has repeatedly heard testimony over the past 2 years that our country faces more serious, complex security challenges now than we have ever faced before. And the hearings and briefings we have held on the current state of our military have been disturbing. The administration's budget request of $603 billion for base requirements is 6% above the 17 enacted level and 3% above the last Obama administration budget proposal. It's also $37 billion below what this committee assessed last fall was needed and about $58 billion below the FY12 Gates budget, which was independently validated by the Bipartisan National Defense Panel. But of course, the issue is not about numbers. The issue is about what those numbers provide for the men and women who serve and what security the budget provides to the nation. It's about whether we can defend the U.S. and our allies against North Korean missiles, for example. It's about whether we have the number of ships and planes and other military capability to deter aggression and maintain peace. It's about doing right by our most valuable asset, our people. The men and women who serve deserve the best weapons and equipment our country can provide, and I'm afraid today they're not getting it. It's always tempting to divert this discussion into a broader budget debate about taxes and other spending issues. Those issues are not within the jurisdiction of this committee or of these witnesses. But regardless of our views on those other issues, we cannot wait until we solve our budget problems to adequately fund our military. We cannot wait until we perfect our acquisition system to have planes that fly and ships that sail. The world is not stopping and waiting on us to get our act together. It moves on, and it's moving on in a dangerous direction. 2018 is a key decision point. We've spent 6 years just getting by, asking more and more of those who serve and putting off the choices that have to be made. We cannot keep piling missions on our service members without ensuring they have all they need to succeed. Does the administration's budget proposal accomplish that goal? That is the question we intend to examine tonight. I yield to the ranking member, Mr. Smith, for any comments he'd like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I agree with much of what you said, and I think the best way to sum it up is what you said about putting off choices. That's what we've done for quite a while, and not just on the defense budget, but on our tax reform, on all aspects of the budget as well. And I think the impact on the military is as the chairman describes. And the real problem we have right now is a major disconnect between what we would like to do and the amount of money that we're prepared to do it. As the chairman mentioned, even the president's budget at 603 does not match what our committee assessed was needed. I think even more tellingly, it doesn't match what the president has said he's going to do. In fact, it is very, very distant from that. If you talk about a 350-ship Navy, I think 570,000 person Army, you talk about all the planes, all the nuclear modernization that they want to do, I don't even begin to know what the yearly number would be to get to that. I'm suspecting it's well north of $700–800 billion. So we have all these grand ideas of what we want. We don't have the money to get there. And who's left in the lurch? The people that you serve, the men and women of the military, are left with missions that they don't have the resources to fulfill. And I think we have to start making choices. And I've got a bit of a preview of your opening remarks, and I agree with you. Certainly, the House of Representatives is in no position to lecture you about making choices. We don't have a budget. It's the middle of June. I've been here 20 years. We have never gone this long without providing numbers for the basic appropriations bills, defense being chief among them. So we continue to stall, I think, in hopes that the money will magically appear or we'll figure out some way to spend money that doesn't count, something. But we got to make choices. We got to decide what we're going to fund. And I will disagree with the chairman on one issue, and that is the notion that somehow, as the Armed Services Committee, everything else that goes on in the budget really doesn't have anything to do with us, so we shouldn't worry about it. One thing most certainly does, and that is revenue. Because how much money you have, in my experience anyway, has a profound impact on how much money you are able to spend. You know, I'll skip for the moment the argument about the Department of Homeland Security and how important the State Department is. Well, I lied, I didn't skip it. But I think all of those things are important. But if you just want to get right down to the basics, even if you just want to say forget about all that, all we're concerned about is the Armed Services Committee and providing for the men and women in our military the resources that they need, the planes, the ships, the equipment, the training, the readiness, all of that. It is nonsensical to say that the amount of revenue we have available doesn't impact that. It absolutely does. And if we're talking about putting together, and I use we loosely here, a tax reform proposal that's going to further cut taxes by $2 to $3 trillion, and if there are members of this committee who want to support that and then want to keep coming back to this committee and talking about how terrible it is that we don't fund our military, I think that is a huge inconsistency that we need to reconcile. We have clear needs in the Defense Department. Let's make sure we provide the money for them. If we're not prepared to provide the money for them, then we need to come up with a different set of strategies, which I agree with the chairman, would be very difficult. We have a very complex threat environment, from North Korea to Iran to Russia, to a rising China, to not to mention the terrorist groups that are still out there and active. So it'd be difficult to redo that strategy, but we'd be better off doing that than to have a strategy that we have no intention of funding. And right now, that's kind of what the executive branch looks like they're doing. They have a strategy that they have no intention of funding. We have to fix that. Just two quick things, and I'll ask questions about this when we get the chance. I think countering what Russia is doing is an enormously important step for us. They are in a very comprehensive effort to undermine the very values that our country has fought for in the post-World War II environment. They have an incredibly complicated cyber effort, propaganda effort. They are doing all of this stuff to basically foster authoritarian regimes at the expense of democracies and to undermine alliances that the U.S. has relied on in that post-World War II world to maintain peace and security and to protect our interests. I think we need a strategy on that, and I will be very curious to get your take on exactly what we are doing in Qatar. We hear what the Secretary of State says about it, and mere hours later, the President says something diametrically opposed to that. It is a very destabilizing situation right now in the Middle East. I agree with the Secretary of State. We should be finding ways to solve that problem, not ways to throw gasoline on the fire. But I'm just not clear what the administration's strategy is. And considering the fact that CENTCOM is located in Qatar, I would think that, Mr. Secretary, you would have some opinions on what we ought to do to try to resolve that situation. And I would look forward to that comment. And with that, I yield back and look forward to your testimony.
The committee is pleased to welcome the Honorable James M. Mattis, Secretary of Defense, General Joseph F. Dunford, Jr., Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Mr. David Norquist, the Undersecretary and Comptroller, who has been on the job, I think, about a week. So welcome all of you to the committee. Without objection, any written comments you'd like to make will be included in the record. Mr. Secretary, the floor is yours.
Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to testify in support of the President's budget request for fiscal year 2018, and I appreciate the committee accepting my written statement for the record. I'm joined by Chairman Dunford and the Department's new Comptroller, Undersecretary of Defense David Norquist. As noted by the Chairman, he's new, but he will be vital to gaining your confidence that we know where our money is going once you give it to us through a good audit. This budget request holds me accountable to the men and women of the Department of Defense. Every day, more than 2 million service members, nearly 1 million civilians do their duty, honoring previous generations of veterans and civil servants who have sacrificed for our country, and it's a privilege to serve alongside them. We in the Department of Defense are keenly aware of the sacrifices made by the American people to fund our military. Many times in the past, we have looked reality in the eye, met challenges with the help of congressional leadership, and built the most capable warfighting force in the world. There is no room for complacency, however, and we have no God-given right to victory on the battlefield. Each generation of Americans, from the halls of Congress to the battlefields, earns victory through commitment and sacrifice. And yet, for 4 years, the Department of Defense has been subject to or threatened by automatic across-the-board cuts as a result of sequester, a mechanism meant to be so injurious to the military it would never go into effect. But it did go into effect, and as forecast by then Secretary of Defense Panetta, the damage has been severe. In addition, during 9 of the past 10 years, Congress has enacted 30 separate continuing resolutions to fund the Department of Defense, thus inhibiting our readiness and adaptation to new challenges. We need bipartisan support for this budget request. In the past, by failing to pass a budget on time or eliminate the threat of sequestration, Congress sidelined itself from its active constitutional oversight role. Continuing resolutions, coupled with sequestration, blocked new programs, prevented service growth, stalled industry initiative, and placed troops at greater risk. Despite the tremendous efforts of this committee, Congress as a whole has met the present challenge with lassitude, not leadership. I retired from military service 3 months after sequestration took effect. 4 years later, I've returned to the department, and I have been shocked by what I've seen about our readiness to fight. While nothing can compare to the heartache caused by the loss of our troops during these wars, no enemy in the field has done more to harm the combat readiness of our military than sequestration. We have only sustained our ability to meet America's commitments abroad because our troops have stoically shouldered a much greater burden. But our troops' stoic commitment cannot reduce the growing risk. It took us years to get into this situation. It will require years of stable budgets and increased funding to get out of it. I urge members of this committee and Congress to achieve 3 goals. First, fully fund our request, which required an increase to the defense budget caps. Second, pass an FY 2018 budget in a timely manner to avoid yet another harmful continuing resolution. And third, eliminate the threat of future sequestration cuts so we can provide a stable budgetary planning horizon. Stable budgets and increased funding are necessary because of 4 external forces acting on the department at the same time. The first force that we must recognize is 16 years of war. When Congress approved the all-volunteer force in 1973, our country never envisioned sending our military to war for more than a decade without pause or conscription. America's long war has placed a heavy burden on men and women in uniform and their families. A second concurrent force acting on the department is the worsening global security situation. We must look reality in the eye. Russia and China are seeking veto power over the economic, diplomatic, and security decisions on their periphery. North Korea's reckless rhetoric and provocative actions continue despite United Nations censure and sanctions, while Iran remains the largest long-term challenge to Mideast stability. All the while, terrorist groups murder the innocent and threaten peace in many regions and target us. A third force acting on the department is adversaries actively contesting America's capabilities. For decades, the United States enjoyed uncontested or dominant superiority in every operating domain or realm. We could generally deploy our forces when we wanted, assemble them where we wanted, and operate how we wanted. Today, every operating domain, including outer space, air, sea, undersea, land, and cyberspace, is contested. A fourth concurrent force is rapid technological change. Among the other forces noted this far, technological change is one that necessitates new investment, innovative approaches, and new program starts that have been denied us by law when we have been forced to operate under continuing resolutions. Each of these 4 forces, 16 years of war, the worsening security environment, contested operations in multiple domains, and the rapid pace of technological change, requires stable budgets and increased funding to provide for the protection of our citizens and for the survival of our freedoms. I reiterate that security and solvency are my watchwords as Secretary of Defense. The fundamental responsibility of our government is to defend the American people, providing for our security, and we cannot defend America and help others if our nation is not both strong and solvent. So we in the Department of Defense owe it to the American public and to the Congress to ensure we spend every dollar wisely. President Trump has nominated for Senate approval specific individuals who will bring proven skills to discipline our department's fiscal processes to ensure we do so. This first step into restoring readiness is underway. Thanks to Congress's willingness to support the administration request for an additional $21 billion in resources for fiscal year 2017 to address vital warfighting readiness shortfalls. Your support put more aircraft in the air, more ships to sea, and more troops in the field to train. However, we all recognize that it will take a number of years of higher funding, delivered on time, to restore readiness. To strengthen the military, President Trump requested a $639 billion top line for the 2018 defense budget. This budget reflects 5 priorities. First priority is continuing to improve warfighter readiness begun in FY 2017, filling in the holes from trade-offs made during 16 years of war, 9 years of continuing resolutions, and Budget Control Act caps. The second priority is increasing capacity and lethality while preparing for future investment driven by results from the National Defense Strategy. Our 2018 budget request ensures the nation's current nuclear deterrent will be sustained and supports continuation of its much-needed modernization process. The third priority is reforming how the department does business. I am devoted to gaining full value from every taxpayer dollar spent on defense, thereby earning the trust of Congress and the American people. We have begun implementation of a range of reform initiatives directed by the 2017 National Defense Authorization Act and are on track to enter into a full agency-wide financial statement audit as required by statute. I urge Congress to support the Department's request for authority to conduct a 2021 base realignment and closure, or BRAC round. I recognize the careful deliberation that members must exercise in considering it, but BRAC is one of the most successful and significant efficiency programs. We forecast that a properly focused base closure effort will generate $2 billion or more annually over a 5-year period, enough to buy 300 Apache attack helicopters, 120 F-18s, or 4 Virginia-class submarines. The fourth priority in the FY 2018 budget request is keeping faith with service members and the families. Talented people are the department's most valuable asset, but we must continually balance these requirements against other investments critical to readiness, equipment, and modernization to ensure the military is the most capable warfighting force in the world. Investment in military compensation, blended retirement, the military health system, and family programs are essential to fielding the talent we need to sustain our competitive advantage on the battlefield. The fifth priority is support for overseas contingency operations. The FY 2018 President's budget requests $64.6 billion, focusing on operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, increasing efforts to sustain NATO's defenses to deter aggression and global counterterrorism operations. ISIS and other terrorist organizations represent a clear and present danger, and I am encouraged by the willingness of our allies and partners to share the burden of this campaign. Moving forward, the FY 2019 budget, informed by the new National Defense Strategy, will have to make hard choices as we shape the FY 2019 to 2023 defense program. The Department will work with President Trump, Congress, and this committee to ensure future budget requests are sustainable and provide the Commander-in-Chief with viable military options that support America's security. I am keenly aware that each of you understands the responsibility we share to ensure our military is ready to fight today and in the future. I need your help to inform your fellow members of Congress about the reality facing our military and the need for Congress as a whole to pass a budget on time. Thank you for your strong support over many years and for ensuring our troops have the resources and equipment they need to fight and win on the battlefield. I pledge to collaborate closely with you for the defense of our nation in our joint effort to keep our armed forces second to none. Chairman Dunford is prepared to discuss the military dimensions of the budget request.
Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, distinguished members of the committee, it's an honor to join Secretary Mattis and Undersecretary Norquist here tonight. I'm honored to represent your men and women in uniform, and it's because of them I can begin by saying with confidence that your armed forces today are the most capable in the world. However, the competitive advantage that the United States military has long enjoyed is eroding. A number of factors have contributed to that erosion. Since 9/11, an extraordinarily high operational tempo has accelerated the wear and tear of our weapons and equipment. Meanwhile, budget instability and the Budget Control Act have forced the Department to operate with far fewer resources than required for the strategy of record. As a consequence, we prioritize near-term readiness at the expense of replacing aged equipment and capability development. We've also maintained a force that consumes readiness as fast as we build it. We lack sufficient capacity to meet current operational requirements while rebuilding and maintaining full-spectrum readiness. You know, Secretary and the service chiefs have addressed that dynamic in their testimonies, and I fully concur with their assessments. But beyond the current readiness, we're confronted with another significant challenge that I assess to be near term. While we've been primarily focused on the threat of violent extremism, our adversaries and potential adversaries have developed advanced capabilities and operational approaches, and these are specifically designed to limit our ability to project power. They recognize that our ability to project power is the critical capability necessary to defend the homeland, advance our interests, and meet our alliance commitments. Secretary Mattis alluded to it today. Russia, China, and Iran field a wide range of cyber, space, aviation, maritime, and land capabilities, and these are specifically designed to limit our ability to deploy, employ, and sustain our forces. Russia and China have also modernized the nuclear arsenal, while North Korea has been on a relentless path to field a nuclear ICBM that can reach the United States. In just a few years, if we don't change the trajectory, we'll lose our qualitative and quantitative competitive advantage. The consequences will be profound. It will adversely affect our nuclear deterrence, our conventional deterrence, and our ability to respond if deterrence fails. Alternatively, we can maintain our competitive advantage with sustained, sufficient, and predictable funding. To that end, the FY18 budget is an essential step. However, this request alone will not fully restore readiness or arrest the erosion of our competitive advantage. Doing this will require sustained investment beyond FY18. Specific recommendations for FY19 and beyond will be informed by the forthcoming strategy development. However, we know now that continued growth in the base budget, or at least 3% above inflation, is the floor necessary to preserve today's relative competitive advantage. We ask for your support, and while we do that, we recognize the responsibility to maintain the trust of the American taxpayer. We take that seriously and will continue to eliminate redundancies and achieve efficiencies where possible. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you, and more importantly, thanks for ensuring that America's sons and daughters are never in a fair fight. With that, I'm ready for your questions.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Norquist, do you have a statement you'd like to make? Thank you. Let me just alert members that under the circumstances, I think it's important to hold members to the 5-minute rule, and therefore short, direct questions will, I have no doubt with these witnesses, evoke short, direct answers. They're known for that. And put me on the clock, please. Mr. Secretary, when the budget came to Congress on May 23rd, I think other than the past week, you were the only Senate-confirmed person in the Department of Defense of the Trump administration. And if you look at that budget request, it has basically the same number of ships and planes, no change in strength for the Army and Marines that had already been planned. So is it fair to say that essentially what has been sent to us for FY18 is what was already in the works with some minor adjustments.
Chairman, excuse me, Chairman, what we attempted to do with the FY17 supplemental was to fill in as many of the holes in our readiness as possible. With $21 billion, we were unable to fill them all. So part of what we're doing, admittedly, right now is continuing to fill in holes. But the growth that we're developing right now this year is into areas where we balance the force. In other words, we've got to bring in more cyber troops. We need to do some things to expand where we've already got gaps that we cannot simply repair our way out of. We've got to actually buy some new equipment, this sort of thing. So we are still in getting the force back on its feet, a force that you've paid a lot of money for, but it was not maintained at full readiness, sir.
Well, and just following up on Mr. Smith's point, the President has said specifically he'd like to have a Navy of 350 ships. He's talked about 12 aircraft carriers. He talked about Army in strength of 540,000. He's talked about increasing the number of fighter aircraft and so forth. So for this budget in 18 that we've gotten so far, it does not really advance any of those goals, does it?
Sir, it gets us in the right direction. As the chairman and I said, it's going to take 3 to 5% in the future to actually grow the force along the lines of what you're talking about. But I would also point out that this is $52 billion above the BCA cap. And that's not something that we can simply walk in and ignore, knowing it's a reality that you have to deal with.
Yeah, I just editorially comment, I don't think anybody thinks the BCA cap is anywhere appropriate to what we need for our military, and that's what we're trying to focus on. Let me just ask you one other question about this. Again, the White House talks about developing state-of-the-art missile defense systems, and I think the biggest surprise to me was to look at the budget for the Missile Defense Agency and see that go down in 18 from what it is in 17. Can you explain that to me?
Sir, it's a worsening situation. We have a ballistic missile defense review underway, but right now I'm confident that we have what it takes to secure us against the North Korean threat and buy us some time until we can get the review done and come to you with a defensible, sustainable ballistic missile defense buildup.
Chairman Dunford, you talked about that the 18 budget does not fill all the readiness holes. Secretary just testified that he was shocked when he came back into the department and saw the state of our readiness. I looked through all of the service's unfunded requirements, which they are required to give by statute, and there's a lot of readiness in those unfunded requirements. So it is true, is it not, that if there is additional funds above the President's request, especially on readiness, that those funds can be well used. Would you agree with that?
Chairman, I would, and I think it's important at this point to realize that, you know, where traditionally readiness has been considered just operations and maintenance money, when you have a squadron that has only 6 of the primary aircraft authorized that it rates, you can only have those aircraft so ready, and it's still not going to make a difference. The squadron's still 50% ready. So I would just argue that there's really maybe this year now, as a result of the last several years, in many cases, there's a distinction without a difference between readiness and procurement. In many cases, procurement is necessary in order to get units ready.
I think that's what's a point that we've learned over the past year as well. Thank you. I'd yield to Mr. Smith.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, has anyone added up all of the President's promises in terms of defense, as the Chairman and I have outlined some of them? And is there any notion of what it would cost to meet those goals in a 5-year plan? If I'm not mistaken, there actually wasn't a FIDA offered by the President's budget, which is unusual. And I can't help but think that it's because, and you can start the clock on me, sorry. I can't help but think that that's because you didn't want to look at it and see just how outlandish those numbers would be versus the money we have. So do you have a number? I mean, if you have 5-year numbers to begin to get to what we're what the President has talked about.
I do not, sir. We've been digging down into what we can do right now to get the force ready in its current situation that we confront. I think there's pretty common understanding here that that the force is going to have to be improved. That's the common ground we have, and we're going to have to move out smartly and in concert with the Congress as we sort out what can be done and what the targets are.
Right. Well, I would suggest, as I said in my opening remarks, that we get more realistic about that. I don't think it serves any particular purpose to make promises that nobody has any intention of keeping. So if we could down that to something that's reasonable. And with that, let me just say, one of the things I hope that the NDAA is able to do is when we're on the floor, we have an amendment to repeal the BCA and the budget caps. And I would urge in a bipartisan way that we try to get that out there on the floor and let members take that vote. Because the Budget Control Act was 6 years ago. It was passed with the goal of reaching a grand bargain. That didn't happen. It's irrelevant. Now, that's not to say that a $20 trillion debt and a $700 billion deficit is not a problem. It's just that it's obvious the Budget Control Act is a terrible way to go about trying to address it. Can you help me out on the Qatar question that I raised earlier? Now, I certainly do understand that Qatar has a mixed record, but we're doing this primarily at the behest of Saudi Arabia. And if you want to talk about a mixed record, they have a pretty mixed record, too. 15 of the 19 hijackers. Wahhabism is one of the more extreme forms of Islam. They funded madrasas all across the Middle East and South Asia and North Africa. And now I have met with the foreign minister. I've been assured that they are trying to reform and move in a more positive direction. But it just seems odd that we're working with Saudi Arabia to go after Qatar because Qatar is doing too much to support groups that are radical extremists. So what's going on over there, and what should our policy be?
Sir, it's a very complex situation. Each of those countries manifests its own trajectory of forward progress. I would tell you that there is common ground, and that is something President Trump was attempting to generate and reinforce with the trip that we recently witnessed. In that regard, you see Qatar itself, for example, houses the largest single air base that we have and the headquarters, the forward headquarters for our Air Force, our Central Command, and our Special Operations. I would simply point out that we have interoperability capability with Qatar, and I believe that Prince Thani inherited a difficult, very tough situation, and he's trying to turn the society in the right direction. But we all agree that funding of any kind of terrorist group is inimical to all of our interests, and I believe that it's moving in the right direction. We've got to try and help sort this out with them all.
Well, why the disconnect between what Secretary of State Tillerson has said about the situation and what the President has said about it?
Sir, I believe that the President coming back from the Middle East was extremely focused on what they had done in order to try to get everyone to agree on how we would stop the funding of the enemy groups, to include at times gray funding. In other words, it's not black and white. It goes into some kind of nebulous area and shows up there. So what you're seeing is a continued focus on that. At the same time, we've obviously got shared interests with Qatar that, again, hosts the biggest base that we have there. So it's one of those areas where we've got to find the common ground, make common ground, and move out together, and it has been a challenge. It's not tidy. I will admit it's not tidy, but it's something that we've got to work together on.
And just a couple quick comments before my time runs out. One, that Saudi Arabia is a country that we also have to work on that issue. Because while, they've cut this deal, they'll support the Wahhabism version of the religion as long as they don't get violent. The Wahhabism version of the religion pushes you right up to the edge of that violence, and some would argue is the logical conclusion of it. So I think we need to put pressure on Qatar. Certainly, we really need to put pressure on Saudi Arabia to stop the spread of that ideology. And I will assume that one of my other colleagues will ask the question about Russia. We lack a comprehensive strategy to counter what they are doing. I would like an update on, are we going to develop one? Do you see that as a critical need? Am I being, alarmist about what Russia is attempting to do in so many parts of the world? So I'd be curious about your comments on that, but I'll leave that to my colleagues to follow up on and yield back my time.
Mr. Lobiondo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Mattis, General Dunford, thank you for being here and for your service. Funding for Cyber Warfare Command and U.S. Cyber Command has been protected in the budget since 2013. This has been a very high priority for me, given responsibilities on both this committee and the House Intelligence Committee. Admiral Rogers testified recently that, and I'm quoting, "To execute our missions, I requested a budget of approximately $647 million for fiscal year 18, which is nearly 16% increase from fiscal year 17. However, cuts to the services impact our cyber warfare capabilities. Cyber operations to counter ISIS are funded via OCO, which could represent a hollow forces structure, and cyber capability and readiness gaps still exist for European Command against Russia and U.S. Pacific Command against China and North Korea. General Dunford, for you, could you describe the readiness of our cyber forces to carry out the variety of missions they need to conduct around the world?
I can, Congressman, thank you. We identified a requirement for 133 cyber mission teams, and that was done in conjunction with U.S. Cyber Command. Right now, 70% of those teams are what we call fully operational capable. So they've had all the manning, they have all the training, and they're fully operational capable. The balance of the 133 teams are in initial operational capability, and they will be in the coming months fully operational capable. So we're moving towards those 133 teams being there. But I think none of us are complacent with where we are in cyberspace, given the number of threats we face every day. We need to defend the network, develop effective offensive tools, and be in a position to grow the force. And Congressman, I think in FY18 and in 17, for that matter, we began to reverse a trend that for over the past 5 years in areas like space, cyberspace, electronic warfare, we have been underfunded. This year is the second year in a row where we have increased our resources to Cyber Command.
And as a follow-up, General, right now we are conducting operations against ISIS, but do we have the capacity to ramp up for additional operations against a different adversary simultaneously if required?
We do, Congressman, and without going through details, we're actually simultaneously conducting cyber operations now against multiple adversaries.
And can we handle the current level of aggressive cyber activity to counter Russia, North Korea, China, Iran, and others that we are seeing today?
We need to continue to grow the force to be able to deal with those emerging threats, Congressman.
Can you talk to us about what we're doing to track people and support cyber as a career field? To attract people and support cyber as a career field?
Congressman, I know Admiral Rogers has worked very hard on that, as have the services, and I think there's a combination of incentives as well as going out there and recruiting high-quality people and then setting good conditions for them to be retained, but that's something that we're working on very hard as well.
So we are looking at things such as incentive pay or bonuses to attract and keep key cyber professionals?
We're actually using those tools now, Congressman, and always monitoring the force to make sure to what extent we need to increase use of those tools.
Okay, thank you. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here as well. Secretary Mattis, I know in your testimony you spoke about the 3 million service members and civilians that make up the Department of Defense. And I certainly agree with you and agree with my colleagues that this committee cannot be expected to deal with all the issues that we face today. But the reality is that the people who come into our service, the men and women, they came from somewhere. You know, they were educated, perhaps their families were on food stamps at one time, they got federal student loans. How do we reconcile, and in your position where I think you have such a strong voice in this, how do you work with those issues while we're struggling here to fund defense appropriately and looking at all of our readiness issues, and at the same time we see that the President is cutting many of the programs that service the people who actually are in the military. We know that over a third kids are obese today and they can't serve. They're not able to serve because they had drug addictions. There are so many issues that we kind of put them over there and say, well, those don't really relate to our military and certainly not to our national security. I know you've thought about this issue, and what is the role that you see yourself playing, even within the cabinet, to try and have people focus on these issues?
Congresswoman, as you know, I'm not shy about speaking up. I would tell you that we are meeting our own quality demands right now. We have not had to lower our standards at all, but you're absolutely accurate that we have a shrinking percentage of our 18-year-old, 20-year-old, that population we do a lot of recruiting from. We have a shrinking percentage that can qualify to enlist in the Army, for example, as a private. So I would take no issue with it. Yeah, I think it's all of our responsibilities, whether we're in the executive branch, legislative, or we're a local school district member. But it's not one that I can speak about with authority. I've been rather consumed, as you'll understand, with the portfolio I have, but I don't take any issue with what you're saying. So far, I will tell you, it has not inhibited our quest for high-quality young men and women who are rallying to the flag.
Do you hear other voices speaking up on this realm?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, I hope so, and I appreciate your doing that as well. I wonder if you could just turn to a second, and certainly General as well, and just speak to us about your current thinking on Afghanistan. As I think that the public is aware, it's feels much more chaotic and violent, and there are very few options for us. What do you see as the status, and where can we go with this?
Congresswoman, we are taking a regional approach to this. We're looking at everything from the situation between India and Pakistan and Afghanistan, obviously Iran, that whole South Asia area, because if we look at it in isolation, we'll probably have something that's lacking in some area. We are going to have to recognize that problems that come out of ungoverned spaces like that, as we experienced on 9/11, those problems do not stay there. They can come home to roost here. So there will be no turning a blind eye to it. We've got to determine what level of support is necessary and how we orchestrate the international community, not just the American, but the international community, to deal with this. We'll take that forward to the President for a decision very soon.
And General Dunford, I know that you serve very actively there as well. Do the numbers that are being talked about, and are those in isolation from other tools in our toolbox essentially? Do we need to be doing something else with civilians?
Sure. We've listened very carefully to General Nicholson's assessment of the situation. I think we're all concerned about the security trends over the last 2 years, not the least of which is the significant number of casualties the Afghan forces have suffered. So we've gone to Secretary Mattis and the President with some options that might be considered in order to reverse those trends. But as the Secretary said, we'll consider Afghanistan in the broader context of a regional strategy as well. But we do have some things that we're considering to turn around the trends and better enable the Afghan security forces, who, as you know, have been in the lead for the last 2 years providing security for their country. So this is not about us being in the fight. It's about us doing things for the Afghans to be more successful than they have been over the last 2 summers.
Do you have the resources that you need, both in the military and on the civilian side?
As you suggested, Congresswoman, the options will include it's not just about numbers of troops, it's about authorities, it's about other things we can do diplomatic and economically as well.
Thank you.
Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Mattis, thank you for being here. You referenced that President Trump has talked about rebuilding the military and has called for an end of sequestration. You've called on us to help you rebuild the military and end sequestration. And on all that, we agree. As we look to 2018, though, we're very concerned that this budget falls short of our ability to help you do that. There are important needs that you know that we see that are not met, and one of those is the concerns that we have for the end strength and what numbers are needed. So in the discussion of what do we need, we can look to your statements that we currently have an Army that's doing more than it's ever done. And if we look backwards to a time when the Army had less to do, when we thought the world was more safe, it certainly is pre-9/11. Pre-9/11, we had 482,000 troops in active force. Today we have 476 in current active force. Now we know where we were going. President Obama had proposed drawing down the Army even further. It was going to be 460 for fiscal year 17, 450 for fiscal year 18. Chris Gibson and I, working with the chairman, drafted the Posture Act, and the Republican Congress prevented that drawdown, which keeps us at 476 today, still below the peacetime 482 of pre-9/11. Now, General Milley has recently come out and said, I need 100,000 more. In this article here, he is proposing that we have active forces of 550,000, higher than the pre-9/11. If we look at the unfunded requirements for fiscal year 18, we know that the Army has asked for an additional 10,000 active, an additional 7,000 National Guard. Those are troops that they said that they needed but didn't get. And it's very unusual in unfunded requirements to actually have force requests. Usually you have like planes and tanks, not people. So Secretary Mattis, we don't want to give you a hollow force, but if we're going to do more, do you need more soldiers?
I believe we do. I don't take any issue with the unfunded priorities list as far as the requirement. I think the base budget has the right priorities. If there is more money available, then I think that's a pretty good list: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. I would add, however, that we have got to have a stable budget horizon in the future. If we bring those troops in and we don't have a good budget by next year, then it's going to come out of our operation and maintenance and our modernization as we pay their salaries, because if we go under a CR, again, 9 out of the last 10 years we've had some form of this, then we end up with an Army that actually, with the best of intentions, starts hollowing out. So
Well,
it's got to be a balanced approach, sir, and right now I think this is the way to set the conditions with FY18. Excuse me, go ahead, sir.
No, that's okay. Well, as you know, we've been in those CRs because we haven't had agreement between the House and the Senate and the outgoing administration on what to do. And so I'm going to ask you about your conversations with OMB, because that currently is where one of our problems are, as we're looking at the House trying to increase spending to give you what it is that you need. Could you give us some ideas? What do they say? Do they know that you have planes that cannot fly, that you have pilots that don't get flying time, that you have soldiers that are not ready, and that you have shortfalls in ammunition, training, and spare parts? Because the budget that they gave us doesn't fix that. And what is OMB saying? Because we'd like to fix it now. We don't want to wait.
Well, sir, that, as you know, that's why we came to you for $21 billion just a few months ago to start reversing this. FY18 is how we're going to try to stabilize the problem and fill it in a way that allows us to balance the force. This is where we'll get the additional cyber troops and start building out like this. But the real growth comes in 19 to 23 with a program that OMB is keenly aware we need, and President Trump has highlighted to OMB. So we have his support on this.
Secretary Mattis, I got a question I think I know the answer and that you're going to want to answer, and that is on sequestration. 142 of us sent the Speaker of the House a letter asking him to put on the House floor a bill repealing sequestration. Every member of the Armed Services Committee signed it on the Republican side. We certainly believe that the President's call for ending sequestration is important. I recall, and I'm not sharing classified information here, when you called us in for a classified meeting on North Korea, we were all waiting to what you were going to say, and the first thing you said is repeal sequestration. That was more important than what you were going to tell us about what the threat was for North Korea. So I got a question for you. Secretary Mattis, should we vote to repeal sequestration?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for your service to the nation and for your testimony today. Secretary Mattis, in the past, you've acknowledged the impacts of climate change on our national security strategy, stating, and I quote, "Climate change is impacting stability in areas of the world where our troops are operating today," end quote. We are certainly aware of these coming dangers, first here in Rhode Island, being a coastal state. As such, I think it's critical to address how the Department of Defense quantifies the cost of climate change. I also assume that there's a cost in adapting our national security strategy to defend new sea lanes in the Arctic or respond to regional instability abroad as a result of desertification, famine, and climate-related economic challenges. As someone who has thought deeply about this in the past, how are you guiding DoD to address these strategic and tactical challenges?
Yes, sir. I can't quantify the costs. I'll tell you it's part of the physical environment, the warming, and for us it comes down to, for example, we have a new sea that is navigable more year-round, where the winter ice no longer extends as far south. So that's a national security consideration. We look at these as they develop, sir, from the warming climate, and we take it into account. but it's hard to quantify the cost. It's simply part of the broadening appreciation of the situation that we confront.
Can you talk about the steps that we should take to identify those costs?
Sure. Let me get back. I want to give you a good answer. Let me get back to you on that one.
Fair enough.
Because it just there's as you know, almost a Rubik's cube of ways that you address one thing because it impacts another, and how you contain the analysis is actually quite challenging. But the bottom line is we have to address whatever the physical environment brings, whether it's storms in an area where we're responding with humanitarian or whatever else. I mean, this is all part of the physical environment.
Okay. I take you at your word, and I look forward to your more thorough answer then, Secretary. Secretary and Chairman Dunford, I believe that the value of our American power projection lies in our diverse and flexible abilities beyond traditional warfighting domains. Today, these strengths are jeopardized by the administration's short-sighted budget proposal, which fails to recognize the overlapping impacts of these varied interests. For example, underfunding the State Department will strain U.S. efforts to maintain our present level of diplomatic and military influence across the globe, and underfunding the Department of Education and Health and Human Services will undermine the military's ability to recruit the best and the brightest should we fail to invest in science, innovation, and programs that ensure Americans can meet the educational and fitness criteria of the armed forces. This is especially important in areas where technological change is outpacing our ability to match our adversaries, and especially as we're focusing heavily on the third offset strategy. Would you agree with this assessment? What other specific challenges do you face when national interests are underfunded?
Congressman, I'll start with that. Look, I would agree with the point that you're making. Every challenge that we're dealing with right now, there's a military dimension to the challenge, but also we require assistance from the State Department, Justice Department, other elements of the government. What we call whole of government solutions are required, and all of the challenges that you recited all require a whole of government challenge. What we have done in the FY18 budget, of course, is address the resources necessary for the military dimension of those challenges you referred to.
Mr. Secretary?
Sir, the State Department and the Defense Department are tied very tightly as we go into these situations. I'll give you an example of ISIS. We just had a conference here. State Department hosted it, 66 nations, plus Interpol, Arab League, NATO, European Union, and they all sat down together, not to talk about just the combat part, which we were able to address in about 15% of the conference, but 85% was spent talking about the post-combat and how do we make certain when we defeat them, how do we keep them keep the next group from rising. My point is that these take the whole of government effort, and right now the Defense Department and State Department work very closely. Not a week goes by where Secretary Tillerson and I aren't personally sitting down together for hours, and we talk probably 5, 6, 7 times a week as we try to make this a real tight team to address this sort of situation.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Dunford and Secretary Mattis, the last administration was not very aggressive, or in my opinion, serious in confronting Russia about its INF violations. We haven't had a senior military or DOD official testify before this committee that they believe that Russia is going to come back into compliance with the INF treaty. So my question is this administration going to seriously confront Russia about their INF violations, and are you prepared, or will you be prepared anytime in the near future to give us a set of military options for their continued violation?
Sir, we are meeting on the apparent violations, alleged violations, what looks like violations to us. We are meeting on it interagency-wise as we speak, and it probably in closed hearing, at least initially, because we'll also be consulting with NATO allies, for example, on this as we build the international understanding of what's happened. We can brief you, I would say, soon. I can't give you a specific date, but we are engaged on the effort right now.
Okay, thank you. General Dunford, in March, your Vice Chairman, General Silva, testified before us and said, quote, "There is no higher priority for the joint force than fielding all of the components of an effective nuclear deterrent, and we are emphasizing the nuclear mission over all other modernization programs when faced with that choice. nuclear modernization can no longer be deferred as a result of previous delays and deferrals, all well considered. We are currently depending on just-in-time modernization and replacement of many of the components for our nuclear triad," close quote. General, do you share this priority and emphasis on ensuring our nuclear modernization programs remain on schedule?
Congressman, I do, and that priority has been reflected in both the 17 and the 18 budget.
Thank you. Secretary Mattis, do you believe that we should fully fund your FY18 budget request for these programs or decrease the funding until we see the results of the NPR?
Sir, I'm confident right now that maintaining a safe and secure nuclear deterrent is supported by the current budget, and we don't have to wait. What that review will do is tell us where we're going in the longer term, but right now, we know what we can do right now to keep the deterrent safe.
Great. Mr. Secretary Mattis, I'd like to commend you a study by Dr. Colin Gray, which I request be entered into the record, Mr. Chairman. In it, Dr. Gray states, quote, "The American triad now begs for modernization to remain operational in coming years and deserves the attention and support of the U.S. leadership. In particular, the LRSO cruise missile will be a weapon with a performance character that must be highly desirable, even essential, to meet the kind of challenges of most concern," close quote. Dr. Gray also points out the long history of the use of dual-capable cruise missiles by both Russia and the U.S. and said concerns about the LRSO as being destabilizing are overwrought, overstated, and unpersuasive. Secretary Mattis, I'm going to save my question for the record, but I know you're a reader, and I would commend this study to you as you review the NPR. Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, everyone. Mr. Norquist, got a question for you. Just a quick, very quick. Do you anticipate, as Comptroller, that you will be able to keep the timelines this committee would like to see the Pentagon keep in conducting an audit of Pentagon programs?
Yes, we will have the department, all the major elements of the department under audit in 2018 as required. That will include standalone audits for many of the organizations and an overarching audit of the entire department overseen by the DoD IG. Most of those contracts are already awarded. There's one or two that are waiting to be finalized and awarded, but we have every expectation to be fully compliant and fully under audit.
Okay. I anticipate other folks may have questions for you on that, but I wanted to want to be sure you were listening. No, you are. General Mattis, I want to return to Mr. Rogers' questions in theme only when it comes to the nuclear posture review. Do you anticipate the NPR will have will decide on a triad versus dyad debate, or do you anticipate it will focus more on specific programs within the nuclear enterprise? How are you approaching it?
Sir, we're going to have to address both. I think that whether it's a triad or a dyad will be resolved very, very early because of the strength of the triad right now, frankly. But and then we'll continue with the rest of the review.
At that, okay, all right. Do you anticipate that it will come out in stages like that, or do you anticipate one report at one time? Right now, I anticipate one report, but if it looks like it can come out in stages, I'd be willing to look at it. Right now, it's going to come out as one report. Yeah, good. Thank you. Perhaps for General Dunford, so some of this debate in the recent past is that the NSC has been more of an too operational. It needs to return to be more strategic, and part of that discussion has resulted in this conversation about giving operators and combat commanders and those below them in the hierarchy more authorities, additional authorities, especially when it comes to anti-ISIS and other counterterrorism operations. I don't have a big heartburn with that myself, but I do believe that there's still the oversight question. It's important that it's still, whether it's policy set at NSC, whether it's policy set at NSC and DoD together, or if it's a set of actions taken by operators that then evolves into a policy, it's still policy and should be coming back to us for oversight. Now, it's a statement, and I kind of want to get your feel on, one, do you think the changes on authorizations have been either that noticeable or that great in the last 4 months, first? And second, what's your thought on the oversight question from this committee?
Hey, Congressman, I think the issue really is speed of decision-making, and that more than the level at which decisions are made has been the point that Secretary Mattis has emphasized since he came in. I would tell you, having been in both administrations, the fundamental issues of force levels, authorities, and those kinds of things have rested either with the Secretary of Defense or the President in accordance with established policy, so there hasn't been a change in that regard. What the Secretary has emphasized is speed at the speed of relevance, meaning to support the commanders, so we've emphasized that. And the other thing I would just say is that, in my experience, the national security decision-making process reflects the decision-making style of the President, and I'm not sure there's a good or bad. It's the process reflects the degree of detail that the President wants to maintain oversight on. So what we have seen is that the President has delegated to the Secretary certain authorities in order to make him more responsive to commanders on the ground. But I can assure you that on some of the major issues, there's been no change in the oversight, nor will there be a change in what Congress is able to provide oversight for.
Yeah, all right, thanks. Just my last 30 seconds is really not a question, but I do want to put a plug in for the electronic warfare XCOM. It's been a long road to get to an XCOM, and I urge you to make EW a priority, both in terms in leadership and investment and training and in R&D. We've lost it in the past. I think we've finally got the Pentagon where it needs to be on EW overall, not just service to service. So I'd like to make sure you note that. Thank you. Yield back.
Mr. Franks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Mattis and General Dunford, for your lifetime commitment to human freedom. Thank you, Secretary Mattis, that you keep our enemies awake at night. Secretary Mattis, defense officials in South Korea and the U.S. as well have confirmed claims by North Korea that their ballistic missile launch of a liquid fuel HASC-12 on May 14th successfully survived reentry. I consider that to be a very significant and dangerous development. And then a few days ago, Director of the Missile Defense Agency, Vice Admiral Searing, testified in open committee before the Strategic Forces Subcommittee that, quote, "We must assume that North Korea today can range the United States with an ICBM carrying a nuclear warhead." Mr. Secretary, this new and alarming judgment suggests that the North Koreans are making significant progress as a result of their ballistic missile test. Yet the President's budget request for the Missile Defense Agency is $7.9 billion, which is the average MDA budget throughout the Obama administration. So my question is, in your best military opinion, is the threat posed by ballistic missiles greater now than it was under the Obama administration, and is that threat growing, shrinking, or staying the same? And if the threat is increasing, why would we wait for the Ballistic Missile Defense Review to at least fund the $1 billion unfunded request recently submitted by the Missile Defense Agency?
Congressman, right now I would say that the threat is growing. However, what we have in Fort Greely now and in California, I believe is sufficient to buy us time so that when we come to you with a program, I can defend it and I won't come back and say we had it misjudged or targeted in the wrong direction. As you know, this is something that takes a high-tech, very focused effort, and I want to make certain that what I'm asking for can sustain the way ahead in terms of giving us a real capability. But I also assume that every time they fire one of these, they're learning something more, so it's a worsening situation. But we can buy the time right now, Congressman.
Well, let me, if I could, just leverage off of that and say that under your budget request in Fort Greely and in Vandenberg, once we deploy those 44 ground-based interceptors this year, we won't be able to continue to test and improve their reliability of the system without having to pull interceptors out of the ground, which means we'll fall below 44 operational deployed interceptors to protect the United States homeland. I guess I would just ask, are you aware of that? And Do you believe that's an acceptable risk in this threat environment?
I am aware of it, and based on what we think North Korea has and could have in the near future, I am still confident that we can defend the country, and we will take steps to expand and distribute this capability, ballistic missile defense capability, further. In fact, right now, should we need another site, for example, on the East Coast to defend the East Coast, we're already doing the environmental impact statement. So in the event, we've got to come to you and say we need to do more. We're not starting at that point with something that would take some time. So we're not at all blind to this, Congressman, and I accept your concern 100%.
Thank you, Secretary. And General Dunford, would you have anything to add to either one of those points?
The only thing I'd say, Congressman, is that when we look at the North Korean threat, you correctly point out ballistic missile defense as being critical. But when we balance it and you look at our investments in cyber capabilities, the intelligence community, maritime capabilities, all of those also are designed for North Korean threats. When we look at the North Korean challenge, we've got to balance capability development across multiple areas and not just the missile defense capability area.
Well, thank you both, and keep them awake if you can. Thank you.
Ms. Bardallo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses, Secretary Mattis, Chairman Dunford, and Undersecretary Norquist. Secretary Mattis, it was a pleasure to meet you during the CODEL that our chairman led to the Shangri-La Dialogue. With 2 visits to the Indo-Asia-Pacific, I have particularly appreciated your commitment to continued positive engagement within the region. While we, our allies and partners, have been subjected to mixed messages at best from the administration, it is my hope that the rhetoric and the actions of the Department of Defense will signal consistency. So, Secretary Mattis and General Dunford, if you could speak about the value of forward deployed forces in the Indo-Asia-Pacific region in augmenting your toolbox, given political and financial considerations, what additional value is gained by having forces stationed on a U.S. territory? And what flexibility does it provide, and what limitations does it remove to allow you and your force providers to be ready and ready to engage when necessary?
Congresswoman, the Asia-Pacific theater is a priority theater for the United States, for the United States Department of Defense. The value of the forward deployed forces in themselves is that they're a stabilizing element. If we did not have them out there and we had to flow them in the event of a crisis, it could actually be a destabilizing element as people were adjusting to a force that wasn't there before. Whereas if they're out there in position, then they're present, and any adversary would have to consider that if they were up to mischief. I would also say that having these forces on U.S. territory, whether it be Guam or Hawaii, obviously our sovereignty allows us certain freedoms of action and sustainment out there that we wouldn't otherwise have the confidence in.
General Dunford?
Congresswoman, the Secretary kind of outlined it from our perspective. I would just tell you, having been in the Pacific with you last week, let me look at it through the lens of our allies and our adversaries. I would tell you, us being forward certainly is great assurance to our allies that we can meet our alliance commitments, and it also serves as a deterrent to our potential adversaries in the region as well.
Well, I thank you both for your comments. I have another question for you, Secretary Mattis. Reflecting on your visits and discussions with senior military and political officials in the region, what role do our alliances, particularly the U.S.-Japan relationship, play in strengthening our posture and furthering our national interests? Additionally, how is the DoD strengthening partnerships through incorporating inter-organizational cooperation into planning and operations in the Indo-Asia-Pacific region?
Well, ma'am, I came into the department with the priorities of strengthening our military, strengthening our alliances, and reforming our business practices so we get the best use of every dollar that we get. In terms of strengthening alliances, the U.S.-Japan alliance has stood the test of time. They pay an enormous amount of the costs of our forces that are there in the Japanese islands. And we also have a technological relationship with them. They're a very capable force. Their Navy, as you know, uses our systems. There are ballistic missile defense systems, for example. So this is a two-way street in terms of benefit for the defense of our own homeland as well as for the defense of Japan. But I don't think that right now we could find, they're in that top tier of allies, frankly, that we have around the world. I don't think we'd find a better one.
So if you feel then that the Japan and the U.S. in its partnership for the buildup on U.S. territory is solid?
I'm absolutely certain. I've met with Prime Minister Abe, and he is committed to it, to include helping to fund the move of the Marines from Okinawa and the other Japanese islands down to Guam, and we'll continue working it along those lines of a partnership with Japan and get the Marines in place.
Well, I thank you both for your support, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Conaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you. General Mattis, or Secretary Mattis, thank you for your clear statement on supporting the audit of the books and records and the financial statements of the Department of Defense. Thank you for that continued leadership, and supported, obviously, leadership from the top. General Dunford, I took a quick look at your statement, didn't necessarily see something there, but I hope we can count on your leadership among the uniform folks, because you're the ones at the point end of the sword on most of those transactions, and making sure that you've added your leadership to making sure that happens. And so I assume that's the case.
That is the case, Congressman.
Well, thank you. And Mr. Norquist, welcome to a terrific team. You and I were having a brief conversation to start the hearing that your experience, it was at DHS, that
Yes, sir.
they've now finished 4 years of audited financial statements.
Correct. They did not have a clean opinion when I was brought there as the CFO, but they already had an audit, and we implemented a process to turn that around with corrective action plans. DHS now has had 4 clean opinions.
Well, that's fantastic. Obviously, the Department of Defense spends a few more dollars than DHS, but thank you for bringing your talent and leadership to that task as well. General Dunford mentioned something about a 3% above the base rate of inflation would be necessary just to simply keep pace with where we're going. Mr. Norquist, could you give us a dollar amount, what that might look like, assuming just a flat 3%, a zero base inflation, what the dollar amount would be? I know the math, but would you put that in the record for what that math would look like?
I'll be happy to. You want it for the record, sir?
Well, I'd rather have you just state it right out, something on the order of $20 billion.
Well, $639 billion, 3% would be about 18 to 20 billion a year, sir.
All right, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Didn't mean to put you on the spot. General Mattis, you mentioned BRAC in 2021. Obviously, it takes a lot of money to implement a BRAC. Obviously, a BRAC process go through, we'll spend that money, but actually those recommendations then result in a construction and decommissioning, all kinds of expenses that go into that. Saving those dollars on the back end are clearly important, but could you talk to us somewhat about, are there operational reasons why we would go through a BRAC, given that today's force looks dramatically different in terms of training needs? I may be trying to answer your question for you, but I want the folks to know that while it takes a long time to recoup those dollars, there may very well be things that, other than the dollars and cents, that would lead us to make some of those hard decisions.
Well, exactly. So the money that we free up from closing an unneeded base continues to accrue to us. It takes a couple years to start taking the profits, of course, because we have to close the base down. But once those reduced costs for that unnecessary base go away, then every year you're gaining that money for training, for buying new equipment, for modernization. Sure. I am not comfortable right now that we have a full 20-some% excess. I need to go back through and look at this again, because I don't want to, get rid of something or come to you with something that we can't sustain. Then we try and say we've got to buy some land here in 10 years. Yeah. So we'll take a look at it, sir, but it's a great way to free up money.
Well, clearly we try to do that. And the 2005 BRAC may today be saving us money, but that's what I was looking for. Are there reasons, operational reasons, training, better locating folks together that been in separate bases across? Are there reasons why we would do that separate and apart from the savings and where those savings would accrue to the future?
I'm sure we would find some of that, sir. I would have to look at each individual case to state that firmly.
All right. Well, I think as we start down that path of doing a BRAC, the checkered history of the 2005 BRAC, we're going to need reasons other than just the straight savings in terms of making that happen. And if there are operational reasons why we would close some bases, open other bases, build new places in certain other spots in order to train better, more efficiently, be able to deploy quicker and more efficiently, all those things would be helpful as well. So again, thank all three of you for your service, and I would yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Courtney.
Thank you to the witnesses for your testimony today. I'd like to go back to where the chairman and ranking members started off talking about this budget in the context of a lot of the expectations that had built up before it was submitted, in particular in terms of the Navy. Over the last 3 years, we've had strategic reviews, including a cooperative strategy for 21st century sea power. Actually, General Dunford participated in that review again, which talked about the need to grow the fleet larger than 308 ships. We had the force structure assessment that Secretary Mattis submitted last December, which again put an exact number saying that we should build a fleet of 355 ships. We had, in early 2017, an accelerated shipbuilding plan, which Assistant Secretary Stackley sent over, which actually showed a roadmap in terms of how we can jumpstart that process, and called for a minimum of 12 ships in the 2018 budget to again, get us moving in that direction. 3 force structure and architectural studies that Navy architectural studies that this committee commissioned, which actually talked about even bigger numbers in terms of the fleet. And now we get a budget which on the 23rd, it actually had only 8 ships in it. On the 24th of May, it grew a ship. You know, there's no debate really about the fact that, you know, what's going on out there, and we hear from Admiral Harris and we hear from General Scaparrotti in terms of the demands out there that, and we're living off a legacy fleet in terms of the ships that we have out there. I do not understand the hesitation in this budget in terms of taking advantage of all the work that's been done over the last 3 years to have, again, a more robust shipbuilding plan than what was sent over.
Yes, sir. I think once we get our strategy review done so we can give you a compelling logic, not just for number of Navy ships, but number of Air Force fighter squadrons, bomber squadrons, the number of Army brigades, we've got to weave this whole fabric together to make certain we have a joint force that's ready to fight. I would love to have more ships. You're right. There are 9 ships in this one, in this 2018 budget, and we know that we need more. But we've got to get our plan together. As you know, we've been in place here only about 5 months, and we need to get our analysis basically harvested from all those that you just mentioned, and then come up with a planned way ahead. But as you know, ships are expensive, and we've got to make certain that we have the budget to support it. And right now, I can't ignore the reality of the U.S. Army situation, or the Air Force fighter squadrons, the Navy aircraft, all the other things we're having to spend money on.
Well, again, I mentioned all those prior studies, which really were built around a strategic foundation. Again, it was not just a wish list that was put out there. And I would also just know, having been on the subcommittee for 10 years now, is that shipbuilding's a long game. You've got to send a demand signal out that not just the big shipyards, but also the supply chain, which frankly went through a shipbuilding holiday in the early 2000s, and which really destroyed, you know, a really healthy industrial base and supply chain. And I frankly think this budget, you know, undercuts that demand signal that people really, I think, were really starting to believe in terms of what we have seen over the last 3 years. So I would just say that I think our subcommittee is not going to wait. I mean, I think you're going to see, frankly, some work being done on this side to really take advantage of the great work that all these studies have accumulated over the last 3 or 4 years, and again, which we hear in person from combatant commanders about the fact that they're playing zone defense out there against the Chinese Navy and the Russian Navy, and that's really just not an acceptable state of affairs, particularly given the fact that we're going to see legacy ships coming offline in greater numbers than the replacement volume that a 9-ship budget calls for. That is a 308-ship Navy budget that was sent over here, not a 350-ship budget. And again, I have the highest respect for all of you, and I think you understand you know, what's going on out there and the need to grow the fleet. But we've got to do better than what was sent over. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Dunford, Secretary Mattis, Mr. Norquist, again, thank you so much for your commitment and service to our nation. I do want to continue along the lines of questions about shipbuilding. Secretary Mattis, you stated, which I think is extraordinarily important, the need for us to understand that we have been marking time at best here in the last several years and that our adversaries are advancing. That's problematic. You also talked about the capabilities that they have, the ones they continue to develop, and if we're going to have the ability to make sure that we influence the course of events, U.S. presence is critical around the world. Navy Marine Corps team is a critical part of that, and I know I'm speaking to the choir here, but I do want to build on the question I asked before, and that is, across the spectrum, I haven't heard anybody that's disagreed with saying 355 is not a number that we should direct our efforts towards. And this year's budget has us on track to get to the number that's in the outdated 30-year shipbuilding plan of 308 ships. So the question being is, if there's this near universal agreement that 355 is where we need to be, we can't mark time. We need to catch up. Our adversaries are doing everything they can in building additional capacity, whether it's under the seas, across the spectrum with aircraft carriers, surface Navy. The question is it does seem counterintuitive to say that we're just going to do 8 ships this year or 9 ships. I understand wanting to maintain those and making sure we're doing those things. But another thing that's additionally troubling, not just with the number of ships, but this year's budget request actually cuts $1 billion out of shipbuilding accounts. So in that realm, my question is why only 9 ships this year? But more fundamentally, with cutting $1 billion out of shipbuilding accounts, how do we see our Navy getting to 355 ships, and when will we be able to get there? You know, the CBO has done an assessment about when we believe we can get there. We think we have the industrial capacity to get there. The question is, strategically for our nation, the urgency of getting there. Give me your perspective, both Secretary Mattis and Chairman Dunford, about those two elements, the numbers and the dollars reflected in this year's budget.
Well, I share your sense of urgency, sir. We didn't, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we didn't get into this situation in 1 year, and we're not going to get out of it in 1 year. And I recognize the Congress's responsibility to raise armies and sustain navies. But we can't do in 1 year or put a marker down in 1 year that's unrealistic. And I mentioned that we're going to have sustained growth FY19 to 2023. And this is where you'll see the biggest growth, Army, Air Force, and Navy showing up as we're still digging ourselves out of a readiness, operation, and maintenance hole. Furthermore, we're engaged in operations where we have to come to you and ask for OCO funding, Overseas Contingency Operations funding. When you get done, there's a carrying capacity that we can carry as part of the President's budget, and we just have to recognize that. But I take no issue with what you're saying or the sense of urgency as we try to deal with what amounts to years of falling behind.
Chairman Dunford.
Congressman, I think that this highlights the debate we had internal inside the department as a result of not modernizing in so many areas at the same time. What I can tell you is I'm confident we have the right priorities within the budget, but I'm also, as the Congressman mentioned earlier, I was part of at least one of these studies that articulated the need for more ships. And so I understand that also as Secretary Mattis' Global Force Manager trying to meet on a day-to-day basis the combatant commander's demands. This really does reflect the challenge I outlined in my opening remarks, is that this year and last year it started, we're confronted with literally what's been described as a bow wave of modernization in the nuclear enterprise, in the cyber capabilities, our electronic warfare capabilities, space resilience, maritime capabilities, land forces. And so what we try to do is just get the right balance within the top line that we've been given. It's also why I highlighted that minimum of 3% just to maintain the competitive advantage that we have today. And that actually is a marker for saying that if we do want to get to 355 ships, if we do want to get to the number of brigade combat teams that have been identified, if we do want to get to the numbers of squadrons that are required, it's going to take sustained growth over time. And that's why 19, 20, 21, and 22 are so important, because we just couldn't get there in 18.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Ms. Songus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to you both this evening. It's good to see you before us. It seems to me, as we've been talking here today, and you've both given voice to the variety of threats we face, whether it's from those who wish us ill, but also from the changing dynamics of how we have to respond to, for example, cyber, and making sure we're making all the appropriate investments. It's sort of a dual-track challenge we have. It's clear to me that the military services, you all need to recruit from a talent pool that is as broad as possible. General Dunford, you representative, you said how important it is to secure our competitive advantage, and Secretary Mattis, you talk about having the most capable warfighting force in the world, and that does come down to people. An analysis conducted for the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services estimated that only 29% of young people ages 18 to 23 are eligible to serve after you apply all the filters that rule people out, and I think you referenced that number too. Of that population of eligible individuals, more than 51% happen to be women. However, less than 20% of today's active duty force is comprised of women. In an era where the eligible military recruiting population remains on the decline, it seems to me it is ever more important that we recruit from the entire population and not disregard or discourage half of our nation's talent pool. So with that in mind, how are you all thinking about your recruiting efforts around bringing women into the military so that you do have that full array of talents that are needed in this very dynamic environment? And in thinking about that, how do you make the case for the invaluable contributions they could be making to serving their country in the military? So I'll start with you, Secretary Mattis.
Yes, Congresswoman. I don't think in any way we disregard or discourage it. In fact, we are fortunate for decades now to have had superb women. They're not good, they're outstanding in our ranks. I think the quality standards are being met across the board, men and women, enlisted and officer ranks. So right now I would just tell you that they are, without the pressure of conscription or the draft, we are getting volunteers of eye-watering quality,
well,
men and women.
I would agree that that is the case of those who come in, but the reality is of that larger pool, only 20% are seeking to serve. So yes, I think there has to be some thinking on better recruitment efforts in order to bring more of that pool in. But I also wanted to follow up that I was glad to hear in January that in your confirmation hearings, you were committed to having men and women serve alongside each other as long as all parties met the standards necessary for the job. Under your predecessors, the services launched a review of the physical standards that all services have to meet in combat arms, and I've seen some of that process at Natick Soldier Systems in Massachusetts. But to establish the physiological standards in order to integrate women into every occupation specialty. My question is, how are you planning on assessing the progress of ongoing integration efforts?
I'd have to see if the services have identified any problems or our various surveys find a problem. If there's a problem, we will assess it and solve it, I guarantee you.
So in your time, it has been a rather brief tenure, are you monitoring those efforts?
Ma'am, I've met with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the service chiefs, with Chairman Dunford. I did it in my quarters to make it a casual evening where this issue was brought up, and none of them surfaced any problems right now.
And then one other quick question. In the wake of the various social media scandals, what do you think needs to be done to improve the culture of respect across the department as a whole?
I believe that it's very important as we recruit from American society that we make clear not just what the military stands for, but what it absolutely will not stand for, and make certain we maintain good order and discipline. A unit cannot be effective in combat that does not maintain a disciplined lifestyle. I don't care whether it's DUI, driving under intoxication, or sexual harassment, or anything else. When a unit doesn't maintain discipline standards, it's of less capability on the battlefield. So we maintain a mission orientation and make very clear what we won't tolerate, and we field the force.
Thank you, Secretary Mattis. Thank you for your service.
Mr. Kaufman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Mattis, General Dunford, thank you so much for your service to this country. Secretary Mattis, current law requires the military, that military pay is to keep pace with government inflation projections. This year, that would be a 2.4% pay raise. Unfortunately, the administration submitted a budget request that would cut our service members' pay raise. Secretary Mattis, were these decisions based on budget constraints or your belief that pay for the military should not keep pace with government inflation projections?
Thank you, Congressman. We have a responsibility to take care of our families, take care of our troops, and make certain they're paid what we need to draw very good people, and that they don't go off to combat worried about whether or not their family's being taken care of, whether it be health care or retirement program pay. All those go into making certain we keep faith with them. I also have a responsibility to ensure that they can win on the battlefield, that we are providing them the best equipment, that we're doing the research and development that'll keep them at the top of their game. It's a balancing act, sir, as we try to balance what we need to outfit them with to bring them home alive and victorious with what we need to pay them to maintain basically our obligation to these people who volunteer to serve.
Thank you, Secretary Mattis. The military services are already having trouble recruiting men and women to join the services due to competition with an improving private sector economy. How do you maintain the all-volunteer force if you won't pay them competitive wages?
Sir, I think our analysis shows that we are paying them very competitive wages when you stack them up against high school graduates, for example, for the enlisted ranks. We probably have a better benefits package than most places. Now, not all of them. I mean, there's some out in Silicon Valley where I lived for 3 years that could probably beat us hands down. When you look across the United States, we're drawing in very high-quality people because we are competitive.
Secretary Mattis, one thing that I'd like you to take a look at in terms of containing cost, where we can shift those resources around to things like pay raises that keep up with inflation, is to look at every opportunity to shift capability to the Guard and Reserve, and granted those training requirements would have to probably be revised accordingly if we're going to rely on them more, but that I just think that there are cultural impediments within the active duty force that argue against that, and I think we need to look beyond that in terms of our force structure and how we can maintain capability, how we can certainly maintain capability without compromising national security, but at a lower cost.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Garamendi.
Gentlemen, thank you for your service and for your leadership. I'll try to do some quick questions here about choices. We're looking at tax cuts that might create a $3 trillion to $7 trillion deficit in the next 10 years. We're looking at a State Department budget immediately that calls for a $30 billion reduction, and a dyad and a triad. How would you prioritize these?
Well, sir, in my role, maintaining a safe and secure, inside the Department of Defense, maintaining a safe and secure nuclear deterrent with a decisive conventional force that can also fight, has the capability of fighting irregular warfare. The problem, Dr. Colin Gray was mentioned earlier, the most near faultless strategist alive today, has pointed out the enemy will always move against your perceived weakness. So we can't decide we're only going to upgrade the nuclear, we're only going to upgrade the Navy, because the enemy will move against our weak area. So it's going to be safe and secure nuke capability, deterrence, so those weapons are never used, and a conventional capability that no one wants to take us on, or if they do, we change their mind very quickly.
So we don't have to make choices, we can do all of the above.
I believe that we can, that America can afford survival, yes, sir.
Even though it's estimated to be $1 trillion+ in the next 2 decades for the nuclear.
We have gone through this twice before in our history, sir, where we had to hit one of these upgrade times, and both times the Congress rose to it. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'll just move on to something perhaps a little less important. Current law prohibits military-to-military contacts with Russia. Should the new National Defense Authorization Act continue that policy?
Sir, I think that we are right now carrying on deconfliction. We do not do cooperation or collaboration. We do deconfliction in the Syria theater. But for right now, I believe that there cannot be business as usual, military to military. There may be advantages to us deconflicting and perhaps even having talks once they are led, first of all, by our foreign policy and our State Department to set the conditions for the military-to-military talks.
So we should continue the prohibition on military-to-military other than deconfliction?
I think at least the Congress should give a sense of its direction. If it's not a requirement, if it leaves some flexibility to the executive branch and the Secretary of State and the President, it would be best.
You mentioned that we have a new ocean or sea opening up. I assume you're referring to the Arctic. Is the U.S. Coast Guard an important and integral part of the U.S. defense? And if so, is a heavy icebreaker necessary?
I believe the Coast Guard is essential, an integral, distinct, but integral part of our nation's defense. That is not an area I'm an expert in, I assure you, sir, but I would imagine getting through the ice is probably a pretty good idea up there when it starts moving in to keep us relevant.
An icebreaker is about $1 billion a copy, a heavy icebreaker. Should we allow $1 billion of the $638 billion budget to be used to build an icebreaker?
Sir, this is really beyond my area of expertise. I'm not trying to get out of the question, but it's not one I've studied. I'd prefer to study it before answering it.
Thank you. I yield back my remaining time.
Ms. Hartzler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for your service. I have a few questions I'd like to ask on the LRS program. Secretary Mattis, last July, then Undersecretary of State for Arms Control, Rose Scott Miller, testified before Congress regarding the Long-Range Standoff Cruise Missile Program, and I'd like to introduce her written testimony for the record. Here are a few quotes from Secretary Gott Miller's testimony, which she said were focused on 3 key points. First, the LRSO is consistent with our arms control commitments and the President's Prague agenda. Second, the LRSO supports strategic stability and does not undermine it. Third, it is important in the eyes of our allies. She elaborated, there is no evidence that the LRSO or our nuclear modernization program are prompting an action-reaction cycle or catalyzing arms race. The LRSO is valuable in maintaining strategic stability. Indeed, it is the absence of a nuclear-armed cruise missile that might leave us more vulnerable to unintended escalation during a crisis. Without a standoff cruise missile option, future presidents may find themselves facing the unpalatable choice of responding to nuclear coercion or attack with SLBMs or ICBMs. So, Mr. Secretary, as the nuclear posture review continues and you examine the LRSO program, how will you and your team consider the input of the nation's senior diplomats like Ms. Gott Miller? And do you agree with her position that the LRSO enhances strategic stability and is important for assuring our allies?
Ms. Gottmuller's reputation stands on its own merit. I have had private discussions with her as recently as this last month in Brussels, and she's a trusted advisor. As far as whether or not I would stand on the LRSO right now, I'm going to wait until we have the study done, and then I can let you know. But I have no reservations about taking Ms. Gottmuller's ideas on board. No reservations at all.
Great, and I hope that you will read her comments and her testimony on that, because I think it was very, very good insight there. I want to shift gears just a little bit here to another topic. So, General Dunford, in 2012, the Obama administration ended the U.S. military strategy that required a force structure and readiness levels capable of fighting two large-scale wars simultaneously. At the time, the Pentagon stated that times have changed and the United States no longer faced a peer military on par with the Soviet Union. And this worldview was quickly disrupted by a resurgent Russia, an expanding China, and continued instability in North Korea and Iran. So my question is, what do you see as the force structure requirement in order to guarantee American security of our allies across the globe? Do we need to be able to fight a conventional war with China and Russia simultaneously? And are we currently able to fight two conventional wars at once? And if not, what do you see as the greatest capability gap that must be addressed?
Congresswoman, we do confront today Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and violent extremism. And we're going to go through the Defense Security Review. We're going to have a closed hearing on Thursday night, and I would like to talk to our force sizing construct and the challenges we face in a closed hearing, if we could do that.
Yes, but you agree it's important to be able to address all of these at the same time, right?
Certainly one or more.
Right. Okay, I look forward to that. The last question back to Mr. Secretary. I remain deeply concerned about our strike fighter shortfall. According to the Vice Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Bill Moran, 2/3, more than 60% of our Navy's strike fighters, the planes that are launching the entirety of the Navy's attacks against ISIS, cannot fly. I'm pleased to see the FY18 budget request, including 14 FA-18 Super Hornets, as well as another 10 Super Hornets as the top priority of the Navy's unfunded priority list. So can you talk about how important it is for us to address the Navy's strike fighter shortfall and how important new procurement is in that effort?
Yes, ma'am. The bottom line is we cannot simply repair enough fighters to bring them back up to full strength. So we're actually going to have to buy more fighters. Furthermore, when you look at the $21 billion that Congress gave us as FY17 supplemental, much of that went into buying spare parts for fighters for the very reason you're highlighting here, and Admiral Moran highlighted. So we're on to the problem. We've got to keep the modernization going, but we're going to need some gap fillers before we get to F-35. We're going to have more strike fighter Hornets, for example, for the Navy to address this problem. So we share your appreciation of the problem, and we are addressing it. But at the same time, it's going to take a little while before you hear better testimony in here.
Thank you.
Ms. Spear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To all three of you, I want to just say that on behalf of the American people, I think they're all breathing a sigh of relief tonight because you exhibit the kind of confidence and steady leadership that I think we desperately need in the military right now. I'm going to ask you three questions for the record that I will just ask them, and then I'll move on to a question that you can answer orally. The annual report on sexual harassment and violence at the military service academies was just released a couple of months ago, and it is stunningly bereft of answers to some of the most jarring statistics. 48% of the service academy cadets and midshipmen indicate that they are sexually harassed. And of those that actually report sexual assaults, they suggest that there's a retaliation rate of 47%. So for the record, I would like for you to provide to me and to the committee what you are going to do to address what I think is a staggering statistic. Along with retaliation, James Laporta was the reporter that broke the Marines United case. I think all of us here were shocked by the revelations. It's not just in the Marines, it's in all of the services. But he just recently was told that he is debarred from coming on to the Lejeune base by the deputy commander, and I would like for you to explain to us why, after he did a great service, I think, to all service members by outing this conduct, that he would be debarred. And thirdly, there have been, to our knowledge, a number of government meetings, including meetings with foreign counterparts, that have been held at properties owned by the President. I would like to ask each of you if you've or your staff have participated in official government events at properties owned by the President, and if so, did the Department of Defense expend taxpayer money to pay for costs associated with that event, including room and board, meals, or other incidental costs? Those are the three questions. Now, the one I would like for you to answer publicly, Secretary Mattis, you've been blunt in your assessment of Russia as a principal threat to the United States. Russia has been seemingly relentless in its provocations, buzzing our ships in an irresponsible and dangerous manner, flying long-range strategic bombers to Alaska, and violating the INF. The President has been silent about this hostile actions. There's much speculation as to why. But I guess my question to you, Mr. Secretary, is do you believe that Vladimir Putin has any real interest in a mutually beneficial, good faith partnership with the United States? And General Dunford, how do you plan to respond to this Russian military provocation?
At this time, Congresswoman, I do not see any indication that Mr. Putin would want a positive relationship with us. That's not to say we can't get there as we look for common ground. But at this point, he has chosen to be competitive, a strategic competitor with us, and we'll have to deal with that as we see it.
General?
Yeah, Congressman, last year in FY17, we requested $3.7 billion for what's called the European Reassurance Initiative. This year, we've requested $4.8 billion. That money is designed to increase our forward presence in Europe. We'll increase the 3 brigade combat teams as well as additional pre-position equipment. It increases the exercises that we conduct in Europe, all of which is designed to deter Russia and assure our partners that we can meet our NATO alliance commitments. So we have significantly changed our force posture in Europe and again our exercises and capability development with our partners in response to growing Russia capability and aggression.
Do you believe that Russia is our adversary?
I think we have an adversarial relationship with Russia, a competitive adversarial relationship. Yes, Congresswoman.
Secretary Mattis?
Mr. Putin has chosen to be a strategic competitor, yes.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for your service. Just to refresh people's memory on the Budget Control Act, the reason the Budget Control Act was put in place was to effectively create so much pain on the discretionary side of the spending that it would force formula changes to the mandatory side of the budget. Those mandatory changes never came about. One of the challenges that we have is that we're just living longer, and that's created challenges with the funding of Medicare and Social Security, probably better than the alternative, though. But as it is, we live under the Budget Control Act. We as a Congress have been reactive to trying to resolve this problem, and it has created a very serious challenge for the 3 of you at that table. We've talked about the military budget on an annual basis for the last several years, but
General Dunford, if the BCA is not repealed, what does our military look like 4 years from now if we're operating under the Budget Control Act numbers?
Congressman, we'll have some tough choices to make, and it's either going to be a significantly smaller military, incapable of meeting the strategy, or we'll try to maintain capacity, in which case it'll be the hollow force that I joined in the late 1970s. In either case, it's not what the United States of America needs to defend itself.
I would just suggest that the sooner we deal with the BCA, the better off we'll be. It makes no sense to start building a ship today that cannot be completed because the Budget Control Act forces the termination of the contract early. As we talk about those tough choices, a lot of countries were mentioned. Some countries that were not mentioned in your testimony were Venezuela, Honduras, El Salvador, Colombia, Guatemala, Mexico. I had time to visit with Admiral Tidd in Miami a few months ago. We talked about the narcotics flow into the United States from those countries. Approximately 50,000 Americans died from drug overdoses last year. At a minimum, half of those drugs originated from the Southcom area of responsibility. A lot of other countries down there with chaos that are going on outside of the transnational criminal organizations. What additional resources do we need to combat the transnational criminal organizations within the Southcom region? Given the threat that they pose to Americans, why is this not a higher U.S. national security priority?
Congressman, the two major capability areas that Admiral Tidd probably shared with you when you were down there is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, so he can support the interagency effort to stop drug flow, as well as maritime capability to interdict that drug flow. Those are the two main capability areas that he would want to have, and that we have not been able to routinely meet the requirements that he's identified.
General, they are so short-funded that when they have the intel that there is a load of cocaine coming into the United States, in many cases they have to sit there and watch it go by. I know as we talk about all of these other concerns, you've got a lot to balance. But I just wonder if maybe just as we do for OCO, maybe there should be a direct funding line for Southcom with regard to the drug interdiction mission. I know that without training dollars, they simply would not be able to function at this stage. And so I would just encourage you as you go forward to just keep in mind that over 50,000 Americans died from drug overdoses last year, significantly more than have died from acts of terrorism in the last decade. And that war is on our border. It's right here. It's on top of us. With that said, I appreciate your service to the country, your commitment to the country, and Mr. Norquist, look forward to getting to know you better. But thank you for your service as well. With that, I yield the remainder of my time.
Ms. Gabbard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for your service and for joining us here this evening. Secretary Mattis, after the attacks on 9/11, the leaders of our country made a commitment to the American people that they would go after and defeat al-Qaeda. Yet, we've not carried out a serious campaign to do so, to defeat al-Qaeda in Syria specifically, where as a result of that, al-Qaeda has been able to gain strength and territory. In your budget request this year, your request of $500 million to counter ISIS in Syria doesn't include any mention or dollar to go after al-Qaeda. So my question is this for military reasons or political reasons, namely that al-Qaeda is allied with and so deeply intertwined with the so-called moderate rebels that the U.S., Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and other Gulf states have been financing and supporting in their fight to overthrow the Syrian government?
Congresswoman, we have had a serious campaign, as you know, against al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda in the Fatah area has been shredded as a capable outfit. They have been unable to attack America for many, many years. Now, they have franchised out, is the point you're making, and from Yemen to Somalia, from the Sahel to certainly Syria and all. This is a franchised al-Qaeda metastasizing threat.
And respectfully, sir, I agree and understand that al-Qaeda has spread, but specifically with Syria, al-Qaeda's presence in Syria is far greater today than it ever was before, which speaks to my question about our lack of taking them on in a serious way, specifically in Syria.
The location of where they're at in Syria makes them very difficult for us to reach, frankly, and we would have to deconflict even more vis-a-vis the Russians. Let me ask General Dunford if he has anything to add to this, but you're right, they're embedded pretty deeply, and they're hard to get to.
Congresswoman, I know you visited, and you probably know, well, you could argue whether we've had sufficient resources. We do have a dedicated campaign against al-Qaeda in Syria. We do have specific resources dedicated just for the fight against al-Qaeda. But it's fair to say our priority in Syria has been ISIS because we're operating largely in the east, and that's where ISIS has been.
To both of you gentlemen, when your budget is for a counter-ISIS program, your commander's mission on the ground for Inherent Resolve is to defeat Daesh or ISIS, and there's no mention of al-Qaeda. And the fact that al-Qaeda has become so difficult to target specifically because our country has not been taking them on in a serious way, and they have become so deeply intertwined with these armed militants that have been and continue to be working alongside and oftentimes under the command of al-Qaeda with our support through the CIA and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and these other countries. So given the fact that this is the group that's been targeting us since that attack on 9/11, what can we do in Congress and the administration to stop that support of these armed militants that are strengthening al-Qaeda and actually go after them?
I think, Congresswoman, we could start, if this is Congress's intent, with an authorization for the use of military force in Syria against al-Qaeda, with the funding and resourcing. The statement by Congress would show the spirit of Congress, frankly.
Yes, sir, but the authorization that you are currently operating under in Syria was the one passed by Congress in 2001 to go after al-Qaeda and its affiliates. Isn't that right?
That is, we use that authority. Yes, ma'am. The challenge is that right now we have a greater clear and present danger with ISIS, and you saw why in 2014. And we went after what we thought was the priority danger through two different through one administration and now with this administration.
Well, sir, I think the reason why ISIS, you're saying, is now a greater danger is because it wasn't taken seriously. One reason among many, it wasn't taken seriously from the beginning, and that is the concern here with al-Qaeda, is that because it has been largely ignored, it has grown to a point where it has now become difficult to take on and now presents a greater threat to the United States, and this must be addressed.
I think that's fair, and we are addressing it from Yemen to Somalia and other areas, but we're certainly, we'll look at what you're talking about here. It's not that we're not addressing it there, it's just that we don't have the reach right now, and we'll take a look at it, but there's plenty of enemies in Syria, and I'd agree with you on that.
Mr. Cook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank everybody for being here tonight. I know we've had a long session here, but Mr. Scott asked some of these issues, and it's something I'm very concerned about. Quite frankly, I came to Congress to be on this committee, and maybe I might not be as empathetic to some of the other issues that are going on. Everyone's got their own area that they're really interested in, but I'm sorry, with what's going on in the world and everything else, that your testimony is so important. And we've had testimony about being C3, C4, which translates, and quite frankly, I don't think the rest of the Congress or the Senate know exactly the implications of being not combat ready. And that means, basically, if the balloons goes up, we're going to have to commit troops to a conflict where they're going to die or at least be wounded. And so that's a big priority with me. So, you know, we're going to have this debate whether we're going to have a continuing resolution. I think it will be so stupid if we send that message again. And even worse, if we don't end that sequester. Now, my question, you know where I stand, and but I'll be damned if I'm going to bury any more Marines on my watch. If we continue with that, as I described, and we have units that are C3 and C4, and we have all these commitments in Europe, all over the world, what kind of message will it send to our allies, and in this case, particularly our NATO allies, that we've been after them to meet their 2% commitment, yet we ourselves cannot have our units combat ready? And in light of the RAND study, Mr. Secretary and General Dunford, if you could address that in terms of, you know, those 28 countries, actually it's 29 now with Montenegro in there, right under the gun of the Russians, and what kind of message would we be sending them?
Well, Congressman, we share your priority you place on this. That's the reason why we came for the FY17 supplemental. It's why this budget grows significantly. I share the concern that it doesn't grow enough, but again, we're trying to balance a lot of things along with a debt, and I just have to recognize that this is going to take some time to get out of. What's the message we send, sir? I'd say the message to our allies would be worrisome. It will not be reassuring, but more importantly, it's the message to our adversaries that would concern me, that this is a time to test us.
Congressman, I think you raised two issues, and the Secretary spoke about one of them. The first is that I think history tells us that the perception of strength has a lot to do with the probability of conflict. And so if our adversaries look at us and we are strong, and the perception is that we are strong, that drives down the probability that we will have to fight. But then the second thing you raise is if deterrence fails and we do have to respond to a conflict, it will be come as you are. And the cost of not being ready will be in time to accomplish our objectives and in casualties, which is what you spoke about. So I couldn't agree with you more. And when our allies in NATO or elsewhere look to the United States, what they see is what gives them confidence that we can meet our commitments and that we will be strong. And so I think it's fair to say they have concerns about that.
I yield back. Thank you.
Mr. O'Rourke. Mr. Secretary, I wanted to begin by extending my sympathies to you and those who are serving currently in Afghanistan, and to the families of those who lost their lives, U.S. service members who lost their lives in Afghanistan this weekend. And I think so much of what we are talking about and the support that you are asking us to provide is to ensure, as you mentioned, that we are ensuring the readiness and the ability of those brave service members to do the jobs that we've asked them to do. And you've also mentioned, and I think accurately so, that Congress has sidelined itself from some of its key responsibilities, and the effects of those are very serious. And I would add that I'd say Congress has sidelined itself from its oversight and ownership of the wars that we have been fighting. And I want to make sure that we work more effectively together to ensure that we're doing our part. In this budget, in our projections for this coming year, what should we expect to see in Afghanistan? How many service members do we have there now? How many do we project to see over the course of the year that we have a budget for, or a proposed budget for?
Yes, sir. We've got, as you know, a little under 10,000 U.S. service members there at this time. The commander on the ground, in light of the situation, has asked for more. Those discussions are ongoing right now with the President and myself and the Chairman advising him. and I think the decision will be taken soon. We have got to come up with a more regional strategy, so what we're doing is connected to the geographic reality of where this enemy is fighting from. It's not, as you know, it's not just from Afghanistan. And so we're engaged in this. However, the bulk of the fighting will continue to be carried by the Afghan forces, as we've seen over the last several years.
Are the proposals in those ongoing conversations reflected in the overseas contingency operations numbers that you presented earlier?
They're not right now, Congressman.
There may be a supplemental request depending on the outcome of that conversation?
There would be, yes, sir, which would be, we would have to have a discussion with you, explain it.
Something that you told us when we first had a chance to meet with you that has stuck with me since is that the United States has two principal powers, the power of intimidation and the power of inspiration. Mm-hmm. And I guess to bring it back to the subject of the hearing and what the cost is of those two powers, do you feel that we have the appropriate balance of the two? Are we trying to do too much around the world through our powers of intimidation? And to use Afghanistan again, and you mentioned doing more with regional powers, how could we complement the extraordinary service of those who are deployed and whose lives are on the line with the resources necessary to provide the inspiration side of the equation?
Well, sir, the inspiration side is more than just what we deploy with. However, in the deployed category where we're out there with USAID, U.S. diplomatic service, that sort of thing, our education efforts where we fund students to come back to the United States on exchange tours, there's a host of things we do in terms of building the broader power of America's inspiration so that it's actually a player in this competitive against competitive ideologies right now. So are we doing enough? Well, I mean, you can always do more, but you can always do more in the military realm. We try to get the right blend, and I think that we're at least going in the right direction on that.
Do you think we need to do anything fundamentally different in Afghanistan to achieve a different result as we approach almost 16 years in, or by and large, will it be more of the same for the foreseeable future?
I think we've got to do things differently, sir, and it's got to be looked at as across the board, whole of government, not just military efforts, plus allied efforts and internationals. It's along the same lines as what Secretary Tillerson is orchestrating against, for example, ISIS right now, what NATO is orchestrating in Afghanistan, but even broader than we're doing it up until now.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Lamborn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, and General Dunford, thank you both for your wonderful dedication and service to our country. We all appreciate that. Secretary Mattis, I want to ask you about research and development for space and then research and development for missile defense. And I know you see the need for both of those important areas. In your testimony on page 5, you said outer space, long considered a sanctuary, is now contested. This creates the need to develop capabilities and capacities for more resilient satellites designed to withstand persistent kinetic and non-kinetic attack. So in your written testimony, you certainly point out the need for more capacity and more capability for space. And also in missile defense, I know you're a proponent of exploring boost phase missile defense when the adversary's missiles are in their most vulnerable state. So, but I'm just concerned, and the chairman asked you this at the very beginning of the hearing, we're cutting the budget for missile defense research and development. And in the space R&D budget, it's at a 30-year low. So in both cases, we're really not putting our money where our mouth is. And I know President Trump wants to have a state-of-the-art missile defense system. So how do we square the needs out there with the fact that we're cutting and not necessarily, and Mr. Norquist, I'm going to ask you to jump in on this also. Why are we not putting our money where our mouth is?
Sir, it's a prioritization. As you know, right now we have the ballistic missile defense capability at Fort Greely and down in California, Vandenberg. And I think that right now we can first do the study to make certain we know what is the requirement, what are we lacking, define the problem well enough that we are targeted like a laser beam on exactly what we need. Boost phase, you know, is geographically dependent, for example, and that just may not be something that we want to put a lot of money into because it just may not be as relevant as increased naval capability that we can move around. It would be one example up and down our coast to help defend. I want to get this right before we come to you and spend a lot of money. You're going to count on us that we did our homework, and I've not yet done it. And that's probably the best answer I can give you. As far as space, we are taking advantage of some things that the intelligence services are telling us, but I'd prefer to, again, study this a little more. I'm not disagreeing that we don't need the R&D in these two areas at all, however.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Norquist, you're probably itching to answer a lot of questions here tonight, so could you jump in?
Thank you, Congressman. I just point out two things. I don't know how the R&D breaks out among the individual programs, but overall the science and technology piece of RDT&E, the research edge, that's $13.2 billion, which is up $600 million from the 17 budget. So there's been an investment in research and technology in the S&T area, and on the
that's
space,
DoD-wide, right?
That's DoD-wide, correct. So I don't know the individual piece of it, but DoD-wide, there's been an increase in investment in that area.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that, but you would agree with the need for space and missile defense research and development in particular, wouldn't you?
Correct.
Yeah. And General, do you have anything to add to this conversation?
I don't, Congressman.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Moulton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, when I was a young second lieutenant standing in the Kuwaiti desert, you gave me a lot of confidence as my division commander. And I have to say that you give me a lot of confidence today as our Secretary of Defense, so thank you for continuing to serve the country. Mr. Chairman, I'll withhold my praise for you lest I be unduly accused of favoring the Marine Corps, but suffice it to say we're lucky to have you as well. Speaking of that confidence, Mr. Secretary, do you have confidence in our post-Mosul, our day-after plan in Iraq? It would be, I would never have believed standing in that Kuwaiti desert 14 years ago that we would still be there today. With the plan as it is resourced today, are you confident that we will be able to win Iraq once and for all and bring the substantial number of our troops home?
It's going to be, Congressman, it's going to be a long fight, even in Iraq, as we throw ISIS out. We're going to have to deal with the aftermath. I would tell you that we are working this by, with, and through allies, and so I do not have the same control over the day-to-day activities of what is going to happen, for example, in West Mosul in the post-combat phase. But I think that we are going to have to work with the government of Iraq in the what I would call post-combat pre-reconciliation phase, so we don't end up in this same situation again. And we are committed to working with the government of Iraq and Prime Minister Beatty, who, as you know, visited here in Washington 2 months ago, month and a half ago.
Mr. Secretary, from your view, does the State Department have the resources it needs to support the Iraqi government as you describe?
I believe they do. I would defer to the State Department evaluation of that, however.
Okay. Mr. Secretary, in order to do your job, you need to have a workforce. You need to have personnel in the Department of Defense, and there's been a lot of concern about just filling positions. How many positions at the Pentagon do you have unfilled today?
Congressman, I need to take that for the record. Day by day, we're getting more people through the process. As you know, the Senate Armed Service Committee has very high ethical standards, higher than any other department for the people that come to work, so it takes a while for some to disentangle their finances. It's challenging.
Have there been any nominations or any names that have been rejected by the administration, names not requiring Senate confirmation?
I'm not aware of any rejected at the White House. There were some that we were told would not make it through Capitol Hill, but I had no one that I can think of rejected there.
Is there anyone that you have brought on to the Department of Defense who has subsequently been pulled out for political reasons by the White House?
I can't think. I've only had a few, as you know, brought on, and Secretary of the Air Force, Comptroller, I don't have very many. No, I haven't had any pulled out by the White House.
Okay. Mr. Secretary, I'd like to move on to the role of Congress in all of this, and you've outlined, as has the Chairman, the responsibilities that we have to ensure a proper budget, proper resources, to come to grips with the financial situation of the country, which people in your position have cited as one of the greatest threats to our national defense. What are, if you could name the top 5 programs or projects that you don't want at the Department of Defense, but we here in Congress force upon you, thereby taking away resources from requirements that you need to fund? I think that would be helpful as we go through the NDA process.
Congressman, I better do a little homework and get back to you on that. I've mentioned that BRAC is one that I do want that Congress may not want, but I think I can make a persuasive argument on that. But I can't think of something that Congress is forcing right now. But I will look into this and get back to you.
Mr. Secretary, if you could would you be able to get back to us before the NDA markup with that list?
I should be able to get back to you this week, I would imagine. If there's something out there, I'll find it quick.
Okay. Thank you both again very much for your service. We're proud to have you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Bridenstine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I think you'll find broad bipartisan support for the budget requests that we've received, which of course increases defense spending a little bit. I think you'll also find some bipartisan support for even more. As a former Navy pilot, currently serving in the Oklahoma Air National Guard, I used to fly counter-drug missions. I'd like to piggyback for a second on what Mr. Scott from Georgia was talking about. I used to fly the E-2 Hawkeye, VAW-77, the Night Wolves. In 2013, my squadron under the sequester was eliminated. My squadron was responsible for busting about $2 billion worth of cocaine every year on the high seas, $2 billion. That cocaine now comes into the United States, and of course, Mr. Scott mentioned, I think you said 50,000 Americans die in drug overdoses every year, which is more than all the Americans we lost in Vietnam, if not maybe close to, if not more. So this is a big concern. As far as the capability gap, I understand when you mentioned that the concern is if we spend too much too fast, it could end up putting us in a position where it's not sustainable, and we could end up with as you mentioned, a hollow force, which is a concern, I think, for pretty much everybody on this panel. I would also say that there are a lot of unfunded requirements that ultimately we could be working on today. And I would just ask General Dunford, when we deploy an Aegis cruiser or a THAAD missile battery, are we deploying those with the full complement of interceptors?
We have some precision munitions challenges that bleed over into our Navy weapon systems.
And are you aware that when we deploy one Aegis, many times there's an underway switching of missiles from one Aegis to another Aegis?
I am aware of that, Congressman.
So these are examples of unfunded requirements that ultimately we could meet today if the resources were there, that ultimately wouldn't put us in a position to have a hollow force in the future.
Congressman, I'd like to just address that precision munitions challenge. We today have requested resources that get to the maximum amount that industry can produce. But there's a caveat to that. Industry can produce at the level of prediction that they have right now. In other words, they can only produce so much today based on what we're able to tell them about tomorrow. So one of the areas that the Secretary has highlighted is the need for predictability and stability in the future as well. And the only way we're going to get around the challenge, that's a great example of why we need stable, predictable budgets, because we actually can't buy the precision munitions we need until we do have stable, predictable budgets at adequate levels. So again, industry is telling us today we're producing at the maximum rate we can. But if we were able to tell them what resources would be available 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, they would be able to increase the industrial capacity and actually address that particular issue. So that's just one of the second-order effects of the challenge we've been in, living year to year with the number of CRs that we've had, is we're not able to give industry the predictability they need to actually meet our requirements. And that's actually the story of precision munitions.
So if we're doing a defense appropriation annually, how do we address that?
We would have to, with a program, be able to provide our industry partners with some degree of accuracy the rough order of magnitude of resources that would be available in the out years. And we're simply, because of the budget situation right now, we're simply not able to do that.
Okay, I would encourage Mr. Chairman and Mr. Secretary, as you look at the budget and as we work as a body here, know that we fully support increasing the defense spending, that we have capabilities that we're leaving on the table. And if we can support you in that effort, whether it's long-term or next year, we want to do it. And I would encourage you to look at unfunded liabilities or unfunded requirements specifically. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Hanabusa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here this evening. Secretary Mattis, in your testimony, you have 5 priorities. The 5th, of course, is the support of what we call the OCO funding. OCO has been something that I never quite understood for the time that I've been here. It was originally not even on budget, so to speak. Then we kind of report it, but it's still a question as to whether it counts, it doesn't count. So in your mind, when you say that your 5th priority is in support of the OCO budget, what do you anticipate that $64 billion to be used for?
This is for operations, Congresswoman, against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. It has to do with any place that we have active areas of hostilities, Afghanistan, for example. And this is over and above the standard budget to maintain our military. These are for the operations we actually conduct there. Unfortunately, we've seen at times things that belonged in the base budget put into the OCO. And I share Congress's frustration. The base budget should have the base budget, and this should only be for those things that grow based on overseas contingency operations.
So your overseas contingency operation definition is the battle against ISIS, and it's Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. Would that be a correct statement?
Go ahead. Yeah. Congressman, it also pays for units that are at home station preparing to go to those particular fights. And we also have some OCO outside of that with the al-Qaeda fight in Africa, as an example.
In Africa as well? But it's also tied to ISIS.
It is tied to violent extremism.
Some terrorist organization.
That's right.
Mr. Secretary, I do know from your history that you're a very interesting person in the sense that your time at Hoover, you've written a lot, you've thought a lot. One of my favorite reading materials that you did was The Warrior and the Citizen that you put together at Hoover Institute. So given that philosophy, that I call it, your philosophical bent on a lot of this, how do you want to put together or come to grips with the fact that we have a QDR in 2018, you've authorized an NPR in 2017, and I believe somewhere in there there's going to be a review of the ballistic missile defense. So do you feel that it's premature, or do you feel that any of these studies could somehow affect what you're coming here and asking us for today?
Certainly it will affect it. There will be implications downstream. But right now we know the situation, the threats we face today. We know the force we have today. We know the readiness shortfalls we have today. And I am confident right now that we can justify the dollars that we're asking for. Certainly we will define the problems, strategic and operational problems for the future that need further addressable. But right now, I'm confident that what we're asking for, we can defend.
Mr. Secretary, you can't come to Congress and on page 11 of your testimony talk about BRAC and not expect any of us to just have a free pass at that. So can you tell me, when you talk about BRAC and you want the ability, you want Congress to give you the authority to consider bracking, can you tell me what your criteria is? You must have some idea by requesting it as to what kind of quote, establishments, facilities, whatever you may want to call it, you want to BRAC, because you must feel that somehow it's excess. We don't need it.
Right. It would be facilities that we no longer need, nor can we foresee using them in the future, even if we have to mobilize, for example, significant parts of our reserves. It'd be the ones that we don't, the facilities that don't perhaps any longer have training capability because of urban spread around them, where we can no longer safely do what we used to do there. It would be that sort of a situation.
Mr. Secretary, is a list or some kind of a, potential BRAC list exists? Does it exist today?
There is I've been told we have 20% excess capacity, but as I said earlier, I am not confident in that figure, and I'd want to look at it again and make certain that we validate the criteria that was used to get there and then go back through it.
Before my time runs out, can you provide us a list, whatever you have?
I can't right now, ma'am, because I'm not willing to put my name to it. I want to study it first.
Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Winstrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for your service, especially in an extremely challenging time for our nation and for the world. And neither of you have to be here, and you're choosing to do it. And it's a tremendous challenge. As I said, our threats are so many. It's so multifocal. It's so multifaceted that it's even hard to list. And the chessboard is more than three-dimensional, in my opinion. With that in mind, one of the things that you mentioned, Mr. Secretary, was that it's going to be a long slog. A lot of these things are going to be long, drawn out. As a soldier in the field, when you know that's the situation, then you look for your short gains, right? Because you want to have that motivation there. So I guess my first question is, how do you see the morale of our military today?
Sir, I'd like the chairman to also respond to that. In my discussions, in the emails I received, the young people are quite, they show a lot of initiative in helping me to run the department. I would just tell you that so far, I think we've got the morale is holding, the affection of the American people is understood, and that has a lot to do with why the morale is held. That said, I believe the families in many cases have become brittle with repeated deployments of their husbands, wives, mothers, fathers, whatever. And I think that that there is some question about the level of commitment when people cannot fly the airplane that they know they've got to be good at flying. They can't put their vehicles in the field. The ships aren't going to sea on schedule, or they're deployed longer overseas because they're waiting for the ship that had to go through more extensive repairs to get up. But let me ask the chairman to just give a few words on that so he's a little closer.
Yeah, Congressman, one of the privileges is having a chance to go around and meet with members and families from all the services. And I think, by and large, morale is very high. But the Secretary spoke about families, and I think I do see some challenges with our families. And also, if you look at some of these readiness challenges, they can't help but affect morale. If you're a pilot that's flying 10 or 11 hours a month, and you're in a squadron that should have 12 aircraft and only has 6 aircraft, it can't help but affect you. Now, I would tell you, we are recruiting and retaining high-quality people. I think morale is better than any of us should expect that it would be after 16 years at war. As the Secretary said, the all-volunteer force was never envisioned to be at war for this enduring period of time. So I think there's a lot of reasons for us to be proud of the morale and proud of the quality of people that we're recruiting and retaining. But I don't take it for granted And I do think some of the challenges we have with our families and some of the challenges we have with people who are in units most affected by these readiness challenges, those are going to have an impact over time, and we should be attentive to that.
Yeah, I think that sometimes the country doesn't always understand the sacrifices that are being made by the troops and their family, and then the challenges that they face when we really don't have them at full readiness the way that we would like to. And so I think that's in part on us here to make sure that the country's aware of that. And as you look ahead, you know, are there things, our current readiness state, as you just mentioned, it has us doing less things than we'd like. And so to me, it's very difficult and challenging for you to make a list of what we're going to do next. You know, how do we have a step-by-step plan? You know, I think traditionally in wars, you know, we take this land, we go to the next step, and we keep moving on. This is very challenging, a different environment than we've ever seen. And you're talking about terrorism as well as near-peer adversaries. So I think it would be helpful to us to be able to explain that how difficult it is if we aren't fully ready and equipped to even compile a plan that can get us where we want to be someday, where there may be some peace. And so my question is, do you have a list, and based on that, does it reflect what you need but don't have?
Sir, we have an assessment that tells us what we need to be ready for, and that assessment comes to us from our regional commanders based on any treaties that we're in, the protection of the American homeland. There's all sorts of things that figure into what national security looks like. Based on that, we know a number of forces that we need and what level of readiness, how fast they have to be ready to deploy. So that's the way we